All right. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Fahuri. I'm the director of the Cancer Legal Resource Center. And today we're going to be talking about cancer and financial toxicity, ways to prevent and potentially manage medical debt and other debt that we all potentially incur over the course of our lifetimes. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. I will be recording today's webinar. We will be sharing it on our YouTube page as well as our website. Please feel free to share it widely within your own networks, friends, family, loved ones, colleagues. A lot of information in here is really applicable regardless of whether someone has a serious illness. And I'm going to do my best to leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the workshop. If you have questions that come up, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will try to answer as many as I can at the end of the webinar. So hopefully most of you are already pretty familiar with the CLRC, but I'll just give a little background in case any of you are new. Our mission is to provide information and resources on cancer-related legal issues to pretty much anyone who has a cancer-related legal question. So patients, survivors, caregivers, healthcare professionals. We're a program of the Disability Rights Legal Center. We're based in Los Angeles, California, and we operate on an education model. So while we don't provide direct legal advice or legal representation, we do our best to educate people about what their legal rights are, so that hopefully, they won't actually even need to hire a lawyer. Our goal is really to help prevent legal struggles and legal issues where we can. If I'm not able to answer all of the questions that you have today, please know that you are still able to reach out to us. We have a national telephone assistance line. We have an online intake form for the hotline, and we provide individualized information based on the questions that you have. If you don't have the internet access, although I assume all of you do, but if you have patients or friends or family who don't have internet access or don't feel comfortable sharing information through the online form, you can always leave us a message at 866-THE-CLRC, and we'll give you a call back to complete an intake over the phone. So we do have a number of other webinars coming up over the course of this year. We have all of our webinars from the past archived on our YouTube page. But the ones that are coming up in May, we have one on immigration policies and how they affect people with cancer. In August, we have one on cancer and college. So, accommodations in higher education, information about student loans and student loan discharge. And then in October, we will also have a webinar on insurance and open enrollment. So I'll be touching a little bit on insurance today, but we do have a number of other resources that go into a bit more detail. The CLRC also maintains a library of fact sheets and handouts on a variety of cancer-related legal issues on our website, including a resource called our Patient Legal Handbook. The handbook provides a brief overview of many of the most common questions that we hear about on our hotline and when we're out in the community talking with folks. And our newest version was released in the second half of last year. Thanks to our wonderful sponsors, Breakaway from Cancer and the American Cancer Society, we've been able to print a lot of hard copies in English and Spanish. So we're not shipping individual copies. We do have the PDF version available on our website in both English and Spanish. But if you're looking to potentially share this resource with patients, or at a facility, or if you're part of a nonprofit organization and you'd like to make a bulk order, we are shipping bulk orders at no cost, and you can submit a order on our website, also cancerlegalresources.org. Oh, and one last thing actually that I wanted to mention is that we are in the process of updating a number of our fact sheets, and we are going to be releasing several fact sheets on issues related to this webinar. So maximizing insurance coverage, understanding credit reporting and credit scores, tips for reviewing and negotiating medical bills, and options for paying medical bills and other debt. So if you're not already on our newsletter list, please sign up on our website. You'll get a notification, I think, hopefully within the next month or so, once our new publications have been finalized and posted on the website. Okay, so we're going to be covering quite a bit of information today. Obviously, cancer is an extremely expensive illness, even for those who have good health insurance coverage. So maybe you've heard the term cancer-related financial toxicity, maybe you haven't, but essentially it's financial distress or problems that affect people with cancer due to the cost of treatment. Because cancer treatment affects a patient's ability to work and also potentially pay bills, financial toxicity is often also caused by a loss of income. Even the best insurance doesn't cover 100% of medical costs, so having a good job with good insurance doesn't always prevent financial burdens or toxicity. This is especially true when you take transportation, parking at a hospital, potentially housing, and other hidden or indirect costs into consideration. And it can be extremely difficult to get coverage for those costs, even with the best of insurance plans. So, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, medical debt is the #1 reason for bankruptcy filings in the US. And in 2014, it was estimated that 40% of Americans had debt from a medical issue. A recent study in the American Journal of Medicine found that 42% of patients depleted 100% of their assets, an average loss of $92,000 within 2 years of diagnosis. So there are a number of ways to help minimize cancer-related financial toxicity, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. Consumer protections, debt management options, optimizing and maintaining health insurance, and of course, income replacement is always helpful. So cancer, as I mentioned, is one of the most expensive medical conditions, second only to heart disease. And insurance and co-pays and co-insurance are just a couple of pieces of the financial toxicity puzzle. Pretty much everyone will have some or a lot of out-of-pocket costs. Prescription drugs for cancer are often more expensive than those for other conditions. Obviously, people have to take time off of work for treatment. Family members might have to take time off as well, so lost wages are incurred there. And then, of course, if someone has more than one cancer or their cancer comes back, that just sort of piles on to the financial burden. One study showed that working people who are getting cancer treatment missed about 22 more work days a year than those who did not have any cancer treatment. Frankly, 22 days out of the year sounds pretty low to me based on, how many people we talk about who need to take extended medical leaves. So as you can see, that can have a huge impact on, financial burdens associated with cancer. So Section 1, the first step in preventing or minimizing financial toxicity and to address practical financial concerns is to have and understand how to use health insurance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about health insurance options today and options for healthcare if you or your patients can't get insurance. I know we have a mix of people on the webinar today. So I'll go over a little bit of information about insurance appeals, but this is really going to be a quick overview. As I mentioned, we do have a lot of other materials and webinars available that go into a little bit more detail about health insurance. Despite the fact that we look to our doctors and other healthcare providers to know everything they need to know about our health and to make informed decisions about our care, our providers are not necessarily the ones responsible for making sure that the care they recommend is actually covered by our insurance plans. It is, unfortunately, the patient's responsibility to understand their own insurance coverage. Having an understanding of what is covered and what cost sharing is required can help a patient plan ahead for their finances and avoid unforeseen costs. For those of you who are providers, encourage your patients to find out information about their policy. The easiest way to find information about, what your health insurance plan covers is through the summary plan description or evidence of coverage description. Usually those plan documents can be found on the insurance website. Most private insurance plans have an option where you can sign in online and access information about your claims and about your plan in general, and all sorts of other information about doctors in your network. So the first place is probably to look at the insurance website. If you can't find it or can't get access or would prefer a hard copy, you can always call the insurance company directly. They're required to provide a hard copy. And if you have insurance through work and you're still struggling to get access to information, you can always talk to your HR department. Really, though, what is important is that patients should become familiar with co-pays, so the amount that you might have to pay every time you go see a doctor or get a specific service. Deductible is an important thing to understand so that you know how much you have to pay out of pocket each year before your insurance kicks in. And then coinsurance responsibilities. A coinsurance is something that you might have to pay for certain services, and it's a percentage of the cost as opposed to a fixed rate like a copay. Patients should also be aware of any services that might require prior authorization. If you are required to get prior authorization for something and then you don't, most likely the insurance company will simply tell you that you're out of luck, you didn't follow the rules, and you might have to end up paying out of pocket for whatever that service was. So it is very important that you don't skip that step if there is something that requires prior authorization. Additionally, it's important for patients to understand their insurance network, whether there's reimbursement for out-of-network services, and the best way to confirm whether or not a particular provider is in your insurance network is to actually contact the provider directly. I mentioned that the plan website might have a provider search option. It might have a list of doctors that might be covered under your insurance network, but those lists are often grossly out of date and inaccurate, and it's really not a good idea to rely on them alone to figure out whether or not someone is actually in your insurance network. So we always recommend that you contact the provider or the hospital directly to make that confirmation. One other thing that I want to mention here is that new precision medicine treatments are often considered experimental, and few private insurers cover genomic sequencing, which is scanning the DNA of tumors to find, if there are mutations that might be susceptible to available drugs that are on the market. So always double check this before moving forward with treatment so that you're not surprised by a bill. I think there's a lot of talk about these new precision medicine treatments, and there's not enough discussion about whether or not they're actually covered by insurance. Okay, of course, having insurance in the first place is one huge step towards addressing practical financial concerns. One or more of the following options might be available to you or to your patients. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but essentially, many people have employer-sponsored coverage. If somebody loses or needs to leave their job, they might obviously be concerned about maintaining their insurance coverage. So COBRA is a federal law that provides the right to stay on that same insurance. There's also potentially state laws that provide the same right to stay on that same insurance. The benefit is that nothing has to change. You don't have to change doctors or networks or anything like that. The downside, of course, with COBRA is that it can be very expensive because the patient becomes responsible for the entire cost of the monthly premiums. Whereas under employer-sponsored coverage, usually the employer pays a pretty significant percentage of the monthly premium. If COBRA is too expensive or doesn't make sense for someone for any given reason, another alternative is to purchase insurance through the state marketplace. Several states have their own marketplace, like in California here, we have Covered California. Many states use healthcare.gov as their insurance marketplace. And depending on someone's income, they could potentially qualify for tax credits that would lower the amounts of their monthly premiums. It can be tempting if somebody is shopping for new insurance. It can be tempting to buy the cheapest plan, the one with the lowest monthly cost. But some of those plans with lower premiums may end up costing more in the long run if they have higher deductibles or higher out-of-pocket costs. You might think you're getting a great deal by just spending $200 a month on a bare bones plan, but if you get sick or if it turns out you need pretty significant testing done or other services or treatments, the cost sharing that you might incur could definitely make it so that that inexpensive plan ends up costing you way more than if you had just paid more on a monthly basis. Obviously, that can be challenging, figuring out what you can actually afford, but that is something to keep in mind. Medicaid is another potential option. It's a health coverage program run by each individual state. Eligibility traditionally is based on low income, low assets, and potentially having a disability or meeting some other category of eligibility. Most states have actually expanded their Medicaid programs to cover people just based on income under 138% of the federal poverty line, which for an individual is about $16,000 to $17,000 per year. So it's pretty low income. Medicare is another option depending on your age or whether you've been receiving Social Security disability insurance for at least 2 years. So it's available once someone turns 65 or if you've been receiving SSDI for 24 months. There are a couple other exceptions, but for the most part, those are the main ways to become eligible for Medicare. And the one thing that I'll mention about Medicare is that we unfortunately hear too frequently from callers who delayed enrollment in Medicare because they assumed that the other coverage that they had was sufficient. So sometimes they're still working, or their insurance is through their spouse who's still working, or they have, their spouse is retiring, and it can be kind of complicated the way that Medicare interacts with other forms of insurance. So at the very least, I strongly recommend that if anyone is nearing Medicare age, that they really do their research about whether or not they actually need to sign up for Medicare as soon as they turn 65, or whether it is actually safe to delay that enrollment, because sometimes it leads to pretty significant penalties that you would have to pay, for the rest of your life while you're on Medicare. Sometimes it means that you have to delay enrollment and potentially be without insurance coverage for a while. So that's just something to keep in mind about Medicare. Enrollment periods are very important. So if you or you have a patient cannot obtain health coverage through any of those previous options, there are some other potential options to get coverage. So for people who are undocumented, they're not able to purchase insurance directly through the state marketplace. However, one option could be to purchase private insurance directly from a broker or directly from the insurance company. And again, that would likely have to be during open enrollment. And then there's a law called Hill-Burton, which gave hospitals and other health facilities money to modernize and for construction. Many of those facilities are actually required to provide a certain amount of charitable healthcare each year, so you can always check to see if there's a Hilberton facility near you. And then most hospitals have some form of charity care or hospital-based financial assistance. You might need to talk to a financial navigator or a social worker or someone in the billing department at the hospital. You'd likely have to provide some information about your income, maybe about other assets, but that certainly is an option to look into if you don't have insurance coverage. And here in California, there was a law passed several years ago that actually requires every hospital in the state to post their financial assistance program on a centralized website. So, it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what the eligibility criteria are to qualify for financial assistance through the hospital. If patients are insured but concerned about outstanding medical bills or the best ways to use their insurance coverage, some of these tips might be helpful. So a couple things to keep in mind. Patients can check with their insurance company to see if they offer a case manager. Sometimes the hospital will also offer a case manager or patient navigator. And then, if not, you can certainly ask to speak to the same person each time you call. And, having a navigator or a case manager can help you sort of keep track of, different bills that are coming in, claim denials. The case manager might be able to help negotiate certain coverage benefits. It sort of varies from facility to facility and company to company, but that's something to certainly potentially look into. One thing that we don't talk about enough is how awkward it can be to have conversations about money with your providers. I think a lot of people don't like talking about money in general, and then, adding the level of discomfort that some people have in, talking to healthcare providers in general, it can be pretty awkward and difficult to have those conversations with the providers. However, if your healthcare provider, whether it's your doctor or anyone else that's making recommendations about your care, if they don't know that you can't afford the treatments or the prescriptions, or if they don't know that you're not following the instructions, not taking your medication as prescribed because you can't afford it, the provider really needs to know that, because they can't help or recommend less expensive options if they don't know what the situation is. It could potentially be very bad for you not to follow, the dosing schedule for certain medications. So again, that's something that is really important for the providers to know. And they might be able to work with you to either help you with an appeal to get more coverage. They might be able to recommend a less expensive but just as effective treatment. So having those conversations are really important. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's helpful to keep accurate records so that you know who you spoke to, when you spoke to them, what did they say, what did you talk about. It won't necessarily help you win a health insurance appeal, but it's something to look back to, and it's always a good idea to keep as detailed of notes as you possibly can. Along those lines, when I mentioned pre-authorizations, if you can get that in writing, that's the best option, because then if your insurance company does come back and deny coverage for the thing that you got pre-authorized, you can look to the pre-authorization and give them that as evidence that they really should follow through and cover the service. One last thing here, billing mistakes do happen. It is important to review medical bills, which also means that it's important to actually open your mail. Opening mail seems like such a simple thing, but as the bills and envelopes start piling up, it becomes more and more daunting. And honestly, if you don't know what's in your mail and you don't know what bills you're receiving, you might not know how long you have to pay them. You might not realize that there was an error. So it's a really good idea to make sure that you review bills. I'll talk a little bit more about billing errors and medical billing later in the presentation. Prescription drug copays are especially expensive these days, especially for new therapies that have no generic equivalent. And as I mentioned, patients might not take their medicine as directed so that they could save money on copays. Common prescription medication issues might be that your doctor has prescribed something that's not on your insurance formulary. So all insurance plans that cover prescription drugs have a formulary, which is a list of which prescription medications are covered and to what extent. If the medication that you're being prescribed is not on the formulary, your doctor might be able to help petition to get you an exception. Sometimes that requires that you try other medications first. That's called step therapy. But we have talked to many people who've had a lot of success with getting a formulary exception for the specific medication that they're on. Sometimes there are discount pharmacies or coupons that you can use to get discounts on the medications. Sometimes it's a good idea to ask at the pharmacy what the cash price might be because sometimes going through your insurance just isn't cost effective. For certain types of medications, you might be able to get samples from your provider. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that, you can always appeal a denial of coverage. Our website has insurance appeals information and also has a couple of fact sheets, one on prescription medication assistance programs and discount pharmacies and that sort of thing. And we also have another fact sheet on there about accessing prescription medications and ways to access those medications aside from, just the discount plans and financial assistance plans. So the last thing I'm going to mention here about health insurance is that you can appeal denials of coverage. I'm not going to go into detail here because I know that we do have limited time, but every state now has the option for external reviews, so an independent medical review if your insurance company continues to deny coverage, and then Medicaid and Medicare have their own processes for appeals. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that many of the practical financial concerns of people with cancer are related to or a result of a combination of high medical expenses and loss of income. So I do want to touch very briefly on job protection and income replacement because those are two things that really can make a huge difference for someone who's facing pretty significant medical bills. So in terms of job protection, and just keep in mind, like I said, we do have a lot of information about these topics on our website. But in terms of job protection, there is a federal law called the Family and Medical Leave Act that does allow people to take time off, either they themselves, if they themselves are the patient, or potentially for caregivers who are taking time off to take care of a parent, spouse, or child. FMLA provides up to 12 weeks of job and health benefit protection. It is unpaid. And in order to be eligible, you have to work for a private employer that has 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius, or work for a public employer, so government. And you also have to have worked for that organization or company for at least 12 months. And you have to have worked for at least 1,250 hours in the last year. So, one of the issues that we hear from people a lot is that they work for companies that aren't big enough to be covered under FMLA, or they've only worked for their employer for 6 months and not 12 months. In those situations, you might still be able to take time off of work, and your employer actually might have a more generous leave policy. But, you wouldn't necessarily be eligible for FMLA leave. Another federal law that provides protection in the workplace is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It prohibits discrimination in the workplace against people with disabilities. And a lot of people who have cancer don't necessarily associate themselves with people with disabilities in general. But most of the time, cancer can be a qualifying disability. So in order to be eligible for protection at work under the ADA, you have to work for an employer that has at least 15 or more employees. You have to meet their definition of disability and be qualified for the job that you're doing. But essentially, it means that your employer is not allowed to fire you or not hire you just because you have a disability. There are state laws that also provide protection. Many of them provide protection for people who work at smaller employers. So, for example, I know in Illinois, the Illinois Human Rights Act covers employers that have at least one or more employee. In California, the Fair Employment and Housing Act covers employers that have at least 5 or more. So anti-discrimination laws do exist, and that is certainly something that people with cancer should be aware of in order to help protect their jobs. So there are some options for income replacement if you or a patient that you have is out of work or potentially on unpaid leave. We often hear from patients and survivors who were unaware of their potential eligibility for these programs. So anything you can do to share information about this is super helpful. So the Social Security Administration has 2 programs, SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, which is based on your work history, and the program Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. Eligibility is based on having limited income and limited resources. Some states have a state disability program. That the state disability programs are generally for short-term disabilities, so disability lasting up to a year, whereas the programs through the Social Security Administration are really only available for people who have a disability that's expected to last for at least a year or be terminal. A couple of states also have paid family leave, so that would be an income replacement program available to caregivers. And then, another option to look into certainly is private disability insurance, although if you don't already have private disability insurance by the time you're diagnosed, it can be very difficult to get it. Okay, so I know I breezed through those things pretty quickly, but I do want to make sure I have enough time to cover part 3, which I'm guessing is the main reason that you guys are all here. So part 3, consumer tools. We already know that to prevent financial toxicity and address practical financial concerns, we should have insurance, we should understand how to use it, and we should understand that appeal rights exist. We should make sure our income is protected and understand what disability benefits we might be eligible for. But even if we've done all that, we can still be subject to debt or other financial trouble. So then, what do you do at that point? At the end of this presentation, I am going to show you some websites and resources that might be helpful. So just keep in mind that there will be resources after I get through the next several slides. So what if your insurance has paid what it's going to pay, you've finished the appeals process, and you still have a huge medical bill and you're not really sure what to do about it? So where do you start? What do you do? The first thing would be to contact the creditor billing department, so the hospital or the provider. It's a good idea to confirm that your insurance actually was billed. I've received medical bills in the past where they sent it to me before they actually even billed the insurance, so I was shocked to see how much was owed. And then that was resolved with a single phone call. You can request the bill to be put on hold. In some states, they're actually required to put the bill on hold, which means they wouldn't send it to collections. And in other states, they might just do it as a courtesy. But if you tell them that you're appealing or that you're working on getting the bill paid, sometimes they will basically press pause. You can also request a detailed bill so that you have a sense of what exactly they are billing you for. It's a good idea to review the charges, see if there's anything that's been duplicated or if the provider has done something called upcoding where, they're charging you for a more expensive procedure than was actually provided. There's different ways to compare rates. You can dispute in writing, but the main thing that I want to focus on with this slide is that a lot of patients are unaware of their right to negotiate their medical bill with the hospital or provider. Many providers and hospitals are not only willing to set up a payment plan, but they're potentially willing to either accept a smaller amount or work with the patient to, get them enrolled in that financial assistance through the hospital if maybe they had missed that or, have become eligible. There are definitely ways to make sure that these bills do get paid, and it's a very good idea to try to negotiate directly with the hospital or the provider before the bill gets sent to collections. There's a lot more flexibility with the hospital. A lot of times, we've heard from people who've set up payment plans as low as $10 a month, $25 a month, just to make sure that they're still making payments. The hospital might not have to honor that payment plan indefinitely. They can certainly come back and tell you, you've been paying this much for this long and the bill is due now, you have to make these payments. But certainly setting up a payment plan can help buy time, and depending on the size of the bill might be the easiest and best way to make sure that the bill does get paid. Obviously, the task of reviewing a lengthy hospital bill might seem impossible, depending on your circumstances, your patient's circumstances. So you can also consider talking to a medical billing advocate or an attorney. Medical billing advocates usually charge either an hourly fee or a percentage of the rate that they end up saving you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some hospitals have financial navigators, and they might be able to help navigate some of these medical billing issues as well. So I want to talk about balance billing. Some people think that if your health insurance pays your medical provider, that means that the insurance has paid the entire cost of your care to the provider besides whatever your copay was. But unfortunately, that's not exactly the case. So if your provider accepts your insurance, so that means that they're in your insurance network, the provider has agreed to be paid what the insurance will pay them and accept that payment as payment in full. When your insurance, whether it's private insurance, Medicare, or Medicaid, pays the provider, they're paying a contracted rate. So they have a contract with your insurance company to accept certain rates for certain services, and that's what allows them to be in the insurance network. So, for example, a provider service could typically be $500, let's say out of pocket, if you paid cash, but they agree to be paid $300 for that service from your insurance company. The $300 would be the contracted insurance rate between the insurance and the provider. If you visit an in-network provider and get services covered by the plan, they've contracted to accept that rate, so you would not be able to be billed for the balance. In this situation, the example I just gave, that balance would be $200. So to bill you for the balance would actually be violating the contract that they signed with the insurance company. So if you go outside your insurance network or get care that isn't covered by your policy, then the provider can bill you for the full amount or for the balance, which is why it's called balance billing. So if the provider you go to see is not in your network, they don't have a contract with your insurance company. They haven't agreed to accept any specific rate. So it wouldn't be illegal if your provider is not under contract. But if, like I said, if you go to an in-network doctor, there's agreed rate between the insurance company and the provider would not be able to bill you for anything additional on top of that. So one thing that's been in the news quite a bit lately is the idea of surprise billing or surprise balance billing. And a lot of people have done their due diligence. They've researched their insurance networks. They make sure that the hospital that they're going to is in-network. They find an in-network surgeon, but at the end of the day, they either end up with an out-of-network anesthesiologist who they did not get to select, or they have a medical emergency and go to the emergency room at their in-network hospital, only to find out that the doctor that they saw in the emergency room is not actually part of their network. A Kaiser Family Foundation survey found that among insured non-elderly adults struggling with medical bill problems, charges from out-of-network providers were a contributing factor about a third of the time, and nearly 7 in 10 individuals with unaffordable out-of-network medical bills did not know that the healthcare provider was not in their plan's network at the time they received care. So sometimes this happens to people. It's called surprise balance billing. And unfortunately, there are no explicit federal protections against this type of billing. So it's not illegal at the federal level. Some states have stepped in to provide protection for consumers from this costly and confusing practice. So in many states and the District of Columbia, there are no state laws or regulations that explicitly protect consumers from surprise billing by out-of-network providers in emergency departments or in-network hospitals. There have been several bills that have been passed into or signed into law over the course of the last year that do provide some protections, but keep in mind that any state law that applies to insurance only applies to state-regulated health plans. So if somebody is on a self-insured health plan, which is pretty typical for large employers, those types of health plans are actually regulated by federal law, so those people would not be protected from surprise billing. Some states have actually implemented mediation programs where, essentially the patient and the hospital have to go to mediation over the bill, and an independent person, looks at the costs that were charged and determines what the most reasonable rate actually would be. Actually, the Texas mediation program has been in the news quite a bit, and I guess at this point they have quite a big backlog of people trying to participate in that program because of the surprise billing practices in the state. One thing I'll also mention here is that there is currently bipartisan federal legislation that's been introduced in Congress that would potentially address this type of surprise balance billing. So keep an eye out for more information about this because obviously it's a very big problem when people, do their best to go see an in-network doctor and then through no fault of their own end up with, hundreds of thousands of medical bills potentially. So another thing that's been sort of new in the last several years is the idea of financing options for medical care. So any family facing cancer is going to have some out-of-pocket costs, and providers are now offering different ways of financing what you owe. Medical providers will often require you to demonstrate your ability to pay before agreeing to treat you. That's normal unless you're in need of immediate life-saving emergency treatment. So your facility might offer something like a medical credit card, like Care Credit, for example, or a private loan through a partner lender. For either option, it is very important that you do your research. Please take time or ask someone to go over the forms if you choose to finance a medical bill so that you have another set of eyes on it before you sign. Some medical credit cards offer 0% interest for a certain amount of time, sometimes 18 months. It might seem like a no-brainer so that you don't have to pay everything up front, But it's important to consider your budget. So even at 0%, could you afford to pay off the whole balance in 18 months? That's something to think about, because after 18 months, the interest rate will go way up, possibly to 25, 26%. And with that type of interest, it could be completely impossible to pay off the balance. If the hospital says they have a lender, for a private loan that they've partnered with, there might be hidden terms. And we've heard of the practice where at some hospitals they're actually offering these loans to people while they're still in the hospital before their insurance has even been billed. So if you are approached by someone in the hospital offering a medical loan, make sure that you have a solid understanding of what your insurance is actually going to cover, because it would be terrible to take out a loan because someone told you you're going to owe $5,000. You have a $5,000 loan you have to pay off, and it turns out your insurance was going to cover almost everything, and you only actually were going to owe $500. So, generally speaking, it's a good idea to wait until you get home to make a decision, even if hospital staff is pressuring you. Hopefully that's not the case, but there was an article that Kaiser Health News shared several months ago about that practice. So we just want to make sure that people are aware of these different options and, are exercising some restraint. Because cancer is so expensive, people often need help to pay for treatment and might elect to fundraise. In fact, there was a recent letter that went viral. It was from an organ transplant team declining to add someone to the transplant list because he didn't have the means to pay for the supportive medicine. And the letter actually encouraged him to fundraise. Even with insurance covering much of the medical burden, people may fundraise to help cover other costs. So asking for help is generally a good idea, but it's important to keep in mind that cash gifts, through fundraisers can potentially impact someone's eligibility for public benefit programs like SSI or potentially Medicaid or potentially a charitable healthcare program through a hospital. So it's really important to understand how those programs define income before going ahead with a fundraiser if the person that the money is being raised for is on one of those programs. So for example, for SSI, if someone's on SSI, income is defined as anything you receive during a calendar month and can use to meet your needs for food or shelter. It may be cash or in kind. In-kind income is not cash, it is food or shelter or something you can use to get food or shelter. So let's say a fundraiser is set up for someone on SSI and their Medicaid is tied to their SSI eligibility. Even if the fundraiser only raises a few $100s, depending on the patient's situation, if that money is transferred to the patient, it could put them over the income limit for these programs and jeopardize their benefits. The value of SSI and Medicaid to that patient is likely much higher than what a small GoFundMe fundraiser could raise. So we just encourage people to exercise caution so that no one has to worry about repaying benefits to the Social Security Administration or having a temporary lapse in their benefits. So one option to help avoid jeopardizing benefits would be for someone else to raise the funds and hold on to them, potentially pay directly for medical bills or to pay directly for other things that are not food or shelter. Medicaid and other means-based programs may have other definitions of income, so it's just a good idea to check with whoever might be the most familiar with the eligibility criteria before going ahead with a fundraiser. If the person you're raising funds for is not on one of those programs, then this isn't really something that's quite as relevant. Sometimes there's simply not enough money to go around, even if you've done all of your research and negotiated your way down to lower bills. Sometimes bills just continue to come in or debt continues to amass. So One thing that can be helpful, at least temporarily, is to prioritize the most important expenses. For example, if you have debt that's secured by collateral, so if you have a mortgage, you're paying a mortgage on a house or a condo, or if you have a car loan, both of those loans are tied to an actual physical thing, it might be important to prioritize those expenses or risk repossession of the car or foreclosure on your house. If you stop paying a car loan or a mortgage, you might risk losing your home or your car. However, depending on where you live, if you live somewhere with excellent public transportation, have a huge network of people that are willing to drive you places and, are okay with Ubers and taxis, maybe giving up a car would be okay. Or maybe your household could get by with one car instead of multiple. Along the same lines, even if you don't own your home, it's important to pay attention to due dates for other essential things like rent for an apartment. We often hear from patients and survivors who are struggling with housing issues because they stopped paying their rent or their mortgage when their medical bills started piling up. We, of course, think of medical bills as necessities, but in a lot of circumstances, patients are able to continue receiving care despite having large outstanding bills, and or may have a lot more flexibility with respect to repayment timing and options compared to rent or mortgage. So the hospital might be more flexible about when they're willing to accept payment on a certain bill as compared to the bank that you're paying your mortgage to or your landlord that you're paying your rent to. Generally, a landlord can evict someone for not paying their rent, whereas you might have a little bit more leeway with the hospital or with a credit card bill. If you do end up owing a balance that you can't pay off, whether it's medical debt or any other type of debt, maybe you owe a mechanic for helping you fix your car, anything like that. If the bill becomes delinquent, which is certainly not uncommon, there are laws that provide protection for consumers from debt collectors. So debt collectors cannot harass a consumer, they can't harass a debtor. There are certain rules about when they can and can't contact you. They are required to send written notice and disclose who they are. If you learn that you owe money, whether it's a medical bill or not, it is very important to ask the debt collector about the debt. So you should potentially check your credit report to find out if there is outstanding debt that you might owe. You should absolutely ask for proof of what you owe. They are required to provide you written documentation showing what you owe within 30 days of making the request. So there are tons of scammers out there that will call and say, oh, you owe money, you can make a payment right over the phone right now. That's generally not a good idea unless you are already familiar with who the debt collector is and specifically what that bill is that you owe. You can, just like with the hospital or provider, you can certainly try to negotiate with debt collectors, and sometimes they'll accept a lump sum that's much less, just because they're hoping to get anything instead of nothing. They will sometimes accept payment plans. They will sometimes offer to remove the negative information from your credit report. You might actually have to ask for that, and they might not be required to do it, but sometimes they will. And then if you don't think that you owe the debt, you can definitely dispute it, and you can do that in writing. I'm going to try to go through the next couple slides pretty quickly because I know we're running low on time. So sometimes we hear from callers who are concerned about their liability for the debts of someone else. In general, if someone dies and has amassed debt during his or her lifetime, his estate would have to pay the debts before his heirs would receive any of his property. While a spouse is not always liable for the debts of the other spouse, there is something called the doctrine of necessaries, which applies in most states, but not all. which does potentially make spouses liable for necessary expenses or debts such as medical bills, utilities, rent, food, and clothing. So things that are considered necessary. Unfortunately, this means that in a lot of circumstances, the widow or widower is responsible for paying off the medical debt of their deceased spouse, the same way that a parent would be liable for the medical debt amassed by a minor child. Again, this does vary a bit from state to state. That being said, this liability generally does not pass to anyone else, next of kin or anything like that, unless someone has explicitly agreed to be responsible for the medical bills. For example, parents would likely not be responsible for the medical debt of an adult child, and an adult child would not be responsible for paying off the medical debt incurred by one of their parents. Again, unless they explicitly signed something at the hospital agreeing to be responsible for the medical bills if their parent could not pay. So I would just caution caregivers against signing anything at the hospital regarding billing or payment unless they potentially want to be on the hook for more bills. Okay, so what if you can't dispute the bill? Maybe you do actually owe it. You can't pay the debt. Should you be worried about a lawsuit? It depends. So each state has a statute of limitations or a time limit when the debt collector can sue you. You can potentially be sued over a debt. But if the debt is really old, you might not have to worry about it quite so much, depending on what the statute of limitations is in your state. In order to have a lien put on your property or wage garnishment or a bank levy where they take money directly out of your bank account, you would first have to be sued by the creditor or debt collector and have a judgment entered against you in court. So, sometimes we hear from people who are concerned about whether or not their wages are going to get garnished, but they haven't even been sued yet. So keep in mind, they would have to get a judgment against the consumer in court in order to be able to do one of those things. Some patients are judgment proof, which basically means that they don't earn enough money or have enough property for the debt collector to actually be able to collect anything from them. That's not a reason to not respond to a lawsuit. This goes back to the thing that I mentioned earlier about making sure that you check your mail and open all your mail. Do not ignore a summons. If you receive a summons or information about a lawsuit that has been filed against you because of a debt that you owe, the worst thing you can do is ignore it, because that basically means that the debt collector is going to automatically win the lawsuit, which is called a default judgment. Even if you do get a judgment against you, there are certain wages that are exempt from garnishing, and there are laws that provide protection for or they limit the amount that can be garnished depending on what the debt is for. Bankruptcy can certainly be a last resort for some people who are really struggling with paying debt. It can also be the best way to move forward and through your medical debt issues or other debt issues. There's two different types of bankruptcy. One thing that I'll just mention here is that filing for bankruptcy can be pretty expensive, and we've heard from a lot of people who, they can't afford the bankruptcy attorney, or they can't even afford the $500 or $600 fee it is to actually file, which is, heartbreaking on so many levels. So I did want to flag that there is a resource here called Upsolve, upsolve.org. They provide free bankruptcy consultations and are a really great service. They make it possible for people to file for free. So I know we're at the end of the presentation here. I did want to share a few quick resources. And as I mentioned, this will be posted on our YouTube page and our website. So don't worry too much about jotting everything down here. For Medicare Resources, if you have questions, the Medicare Rights Center is wonderful. Every state has a state health insurance assistance program. SHIPTAcenter.org is where you can go to find out information about the SHIP office in your state. There are a number of medical billing resources. We don't endorse any of these specific companies, but I did want to make sure that, you had access to this information: the Alliance of Claims Assistance Professionals, MedClaims Liaison, Medical Billing Associates of America. The Patient Advocate Foundation has wonderful resources and provides some case management. There are consumer debt protection resources through the Federal Trade Commission, and the video that's actually linked here is quite wonderful about your rights as to be protected from harassment. And then, of course, if you need to find a lawyer, you can always contact the Cancer Legal Resource Center, or try to find information through the American Bar Association, maybe a local legal aid organization, and then lawhelp.org also provides a lot of really great resources. So I'm going to end the recording now. I'm happy to stick around to try to answer some questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and I hope that this information has been helpful.